Flashing red and blue lights fill the night as a police cruiser speeds up behind a sleek black SUV. The officer inside grips the wheel tightly, his face tense with suspicion. He's convinced he's caught someone who doesn't belong in this upscale neighborhood. As the siren wails, the driver in the SUV pulls over calmly, his hands resting on the wheel. He's been through this before, but this time he has no idea what's coming. The officer steps out, his hand hovering near his holster. "License and registration," he barks. But the man behind the wheel doesn't rush. Instead, he carefully reaches for his wallet, his expression unreadable. When he hands over his ID, the officer barely glances at it before demanding, "Where are you headed?" Then the officer finally looks at the name on the card. His face changes, his grip on the ticket book loosens, his jaw clenches. The man in the car watches him closely. He's seen that look before, the moment when everything shifts. Because this isn't just any driver. This is a high-ranking police captain, and the rookie officer, he just pulled over his own superior. What happens next? You won't believe it. The young officer's face tightens as he takes another look at the ID. His eyes flick back up to the man in the driver's seat, who hasn't moved an inch. The silence between them stretches, heavy and unspoken. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the faint sound of crickets fills the air. "You're a police captain," the officer finally mutters, almost as if he doesn't believe it. The man in the SUV nods slowly. "That's right." His voice is calm, steady. He's not angry. Not yet. The officer swallows hard, glancing around as if searching for an escape. He shifts on his feet, his grip tightening around the flashlight in his hand. This wasn't how he expected the stop to go. In his mind, he had already decided who this man was before even seeing his face. Now, the reality is hitting him like a ton of bricks. The captain watches him closely. He's seen this before, the hesitation, the discomfort. He knows exactly what's running through the officer's mind, and he's waiting to see what he'll do next. Because what happens now, that will say everything. The officer shifts uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the ID before slowly handing it back. His eyes dart around, as if hoping no one else is watching. The captain takes the card without breaking eye contact. He's patient, but he's not going to let this slide. "Why did you pull me over?" the captain asks, his voice level but firm. The officer clears his throat, glancing at the SUV. "You were, driving through a neighborhood with a high crime rate," he says, but the words come out uncertain, like he's second-guessing himself. The captain nods slowly. He's heard this excuse before, but he also knows something the officer doesn't. There hasn't been a single reported crime on this street in weeks. He leans back in his seat, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. He could call the officer out right now, demand an explanation, but he doesn't. Not yet. He wants to see where this is going. The officer shifts again, glancing at the body camera strapped to his chest. He knows it's recording. He knows his words matter. But for some reason that doesn't make him feel any better. Because deep down, he knows he made a mistake. And now there's no easy way out. The officer's breath is uneven now. His mind is racing, trying to find a way to justify what he's done, but the weight of the moment is crushing him. The captain watches him closely, his silence louder than any accusation. The street feels emptier than before, like the world has paused to see what happens next. "I need to see your registration," the officer says abruptly, his voice sharp, almost defensive. It's a weak attempt to regain control, and they both know it. The captain doesn't move right away. He lets the request hang in the air before calmly opening the glove compartment and retrieving the paperwork. His movements are deliberate, careful, because he knows how fast things can go wrong. He hands over the documents, his expression unreadable. The officer barely looks at them. His hands are clammy, his pulse hammering. He knows the stop was never about paperwork. He had a feeling, an assumption, and now that assumption is staring him in the face, waiting for him to own up to it. A crackling voice suddenly breaks through the officer's radio. "Unit 12, status check." He hesitates. He could say everything is fine. He could end this right now. But instead, he presses the button and says, "I need a supervisor at my location." The captain tilts his head slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. The tension in the air is unbearable, because now everything is about to come to light. The radio falls silent after the officer's request, but the damage is already done. The captain shifts in his seat, studying the young cop. Calling for a supervisor changes everything. It means the officer knows he's in too deep, but instead of backing down, he's digging in. The captain exhales slowly, his patience wearing thin. The officer avoids eye contact now, staring at the documents in his hand as if they hold some kind of escape. But before he can speak, the sound of another vehicle approaching makes them both turn. Headlights cut through the night, and within seconds, a second patrol car pulls up behind them. The captain raises an eyebrow. That was fast. A tall figure steps out of the new cruiser, moving with confidence. The captain recognizes him immediately, Lieutenant Harris. A seasoned officer, one of the few in a department he respects. But Harris' expression is unreadable as he approaches. "What's going on here?" Harris asks, his voice even. The young officer straightens up. "Routine stop," he says quickly. The captain almost laughs at that. But before he can respond, Harris does something unexpected. Instead of questioning him, the lieutenant turns to the young officer. "Step over here with me," he says, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitates, glancing back at the captain before following orders. For the first time tonight, the captain feels something shift, because he knows Harris, and if Harris was already nearby, that means he already knew something was wrong. The pieces are falling into place, but the real question is, who is this stop really about? The captain watches as the young officer follows Lieutenant Harris a few steps away. Their voices are low, but the tension is clear. The officer's stance is stiff, defensive. Whatever Harris is saying, it's not what he wants to hear. Then suddenly, the officer's face changes. His eyes widen, and his shoulders drop slightly, as if the ground beneath him just shifted. The captain leans forward, watching closely. Harris isn't just scolding him, he's telling him something he didn't expect. The officer glances back at the captain, his jaw tightening. His whole demeanor is different now, like he's just realized how deep of a mistake he's made. Then Harris turns to the captain. "I appreciate your patience, sir," he says. "We'll handle this from here." The captain nods slowly but doesn't move. He's waiting. There's more. The officer takes a deep breath and finally looks the captain in the eye. "I didn't know who you were," he admits. "I just saw the car and..." He stops himself. He doesn't need to say it. They all know. The captain studies him for a long moment. Then he steps out of the SUV, standing at his full height. "That's the problem," he says simply. His voice isn't angry, but the weight of those words is heavier than any shouting could be. The young officer looks away, ashamed. But before he can respond, Harris speaks again. "Captain," he says carefully, "there's something else you should know." The captain turns to him. Harris exhales and lowers his voice. "We've had complaints about him before. This isn't the first time." The captain's expression hardens. So this wasn't just one bad call. This was a pattern, a problem no one had addressed. Until now. The young officer's face drains of color. He knows what's coming. The night started with him thinking he was in control. Now he's the one being investigated. The young officer stands frozen, his mind racing. He had started this stop thinking he was in control, but now the weight of his choices is crashing down on him. He swallows hard, stealing one last glance at the captain, who hasn't moved. The silence between them says more than words ever could. Lieutenant Harris sighs, rubbing his temple. "Go wait in your car," he says, his tone firm. The officer hesitates for a second, then nods and walks away without another word. The captain watches him go, then turns back to Harris. "You're going to handle this?" the captain asks, though it's not really a question. Harris nods. I'll make sure it's addressed. The captain studies him for a moment, then exhales. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. But tonight, at least the problem didn't go unchecked. He steps back into his SUV, fastening his seatbelt as Harris gives him a small nod of respect. Without another word, the captain pulls off, the flashing lights fading in his rearview mirror. Some lessons come easy, others, they change everything.